I have a question for you. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? If you said 10 cents, you're actually wrong. Do the mathematics. It's 5 cents, because if the ball is 5 cents and the bat is $1 more, the bat must be $1.05. $1.05 plus 5 cents equals $1.10. Okay, this is an example of what Daniel Kahneman talks about in this book. He proposes that there are two types of system, two thinking systems, two ways of thinking. The fast way of thinking, which is often wrong, irrational, emotionally led. He more or less considers it non-thinking, more feeling and gut instinct, going with the flow, and slow thinking, which he also calls type 2 thinking. You can see here the book is called Fast and slow thinking is much more effortful, deliberate, conscious, causes the eyebrows to come down a little bit when you're engaged in type 2 thinking. It's much more rational, logical. You can also more or less consider this reason. Like what Daniel Kahneman is saying is that the faculty of reason is essentially what type 2 or the slow thinking is, as opposed to more instinctual, fast, quick thinking. He does propose in the book that you can get better at fast thinking. It's not always to be avoided, because sometimes you need to make quick decisions. But if you become highly skilled, then your chances of getting something correct or being correct when thinking quickly on the spur of the moment increases quite significantly. But the crux of this book is that one should, particularly if making medium to long-term decisions, important decisions, if you're a leader or you're in a leadership team, or you're part of an organisation and you're thinking about making plans, then really you want to be aware of some of the fallacies and the biases of type 1 thinking, and to use type 2 as much as possible, because type 2, in Daniel Kahneman's view, is a superior way of thinking. It increases the chances of success. The book is quite scientific. Daniel Kahneman gives lots of examples of those biases, which can hinder our ability to perceive accurately the world and to make objective decisions and choices. To give you a few examples of the things that he talks about, so one technique he refers to as anchoring, and this particular technique, so let's say you're going to buy a car, you go to the second-hand car dealership, you see a beautiful BMW 3 Series, for example, and it has a price tag of 10,000. Now the owner of the second-hand car dealership obviously has priced the car above what he actually wants. So in his mind, he probably wants 8.5, or that would be the minimum he would be willing to accept for that car. But he has put that price tag of 10 because he's anchoring your mind to that number in order for you to think that maybe 9.25 is a good price. Oh, I'm getting a bargain. Of course, shops do this as well. some shops and some chains seem to constantly be on sale, and that's in part because of the use of the anchoring technique. When your mind is fixed on a number, 10,000, if it goes down to 9,000, you're more likely to think that it's a better deal than it actually is. So that's one particular technique that Daniel Kahneman talks about. He talks about an availability technique as well, where the easier it is to recall examples or information, or the ease with which you can remember things that happened, have a larger weight and a larger influence in present thinking than they should have. So for example, if you had a really good experience with something in the past, let's say for example you had a BMW 3 Series, you loved the car, and you had lots of happy memories in the car, your opinion, quite naturally, of BMW 3 Series is going to be associated with those happy memories, and that can skew your judgment regarding whether or not you should buy a BMW 3 Series, Mercedes C-Class, Volkswagen Passat, any other car. Might be a more logical choice, might be more rational, might be getting a better deal in terms of what you're looking for. So this availability of information, the ease with which you can recall information, has the effect of making what you think skewed against what you can't see and what you can't remember. One of the things he does talk about is, I want to just read this to you. So one thing is the planning fallacy. The planning fallacy, by which we overestimate the benefits and underestimate costs. In the news recently, there's this the story about HS2. I think when it was first being proposed in the mid-2000s, the cost, the overall estimated cost was much less than what it was 8 years down the line. And of course, the governments are rolling back on some of those commitments. I think they've got rid of one of the lines because the cost benefit analysis doesn't seem to point in the direction of going ahead with it. But this is an example of the planning fallacy, I believe. I am partially against HS2 because I think that the future more or less is in Teams and online communication more than physical transportation, so I am a little bit biased in that direction, but nonetheless I think that one could argue that that whole project, which I'm sure has many positive aspects to it, to at least some extent has fallen prey to a planning fallacy. The unknown unknowns, that's what Daniel Kahneman mentions. Whenever you plan to do something, particularly if it's over a long period of time, we underestimate the unknown unknowns, what might happen, which could be an obstacle, all of those antagonistic factors, which you should certainly anticipate will arise spontaneously and in unforeseeable way. So he talks about that. He says that humans are more loss averse than motivated by potential gain, which many other psychologists have pointed out too. And he goes into a little bit of detail about the role of the amygdala. The amygdala is a part of the brain which responds to threatening stimuli. We evolved the amygdala, and we have two, by the way, because we have one on the right side and one on the left side of the brain. But we have a heightened response to fear, because when the amygdala perceives a threat, adrenaline, cortisol start rushing into the blood, and we begin to get a bit panicky, and we start to think in terms of system one on an emotional level, rather than, no, this is the most logical thing, let's do this. So he goes into some detail about that. In effect, although he doesn't quite say this in the book in this way, I think what he's referring to, so we have a prefrontal cortex in our brains, which is at the front of the brain, and it's the most recently evolved part of the brain. The limbic system, which is much older, is where a lot of the emotions come from. And the prefrontal cortex is able to exert control over the emotional impulses that we have. And this is really what Daniel Kahneman is referring to when he's talking about System 2, is self-control. Schizophrenics, for example, going to the extremes, seem to suffer with ego collapse. And what that is the inability of the prefrontal cortex to exert control on the older parts of the brain, and thus the content of the subconscious or the unconscious comes to the fore. And this is why many schizophrenics hallucinate and they hear voices, because the prefrontal cortex is not quite able to push down on that material. And this is what schizophrenics can suffer with. Also, a lack of motivation, a lack of willingness to act, because once again they lack it's called the executive function. And what this does is that it gives a person willpower. So the schizophrenic sort of becomes a victim of their own psyche, unable to impose order and logic on the contents of their imaginations. On the other hand, you do have people that probably think far too logically. They sort of have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and in some cases it can be very extreme and be a very affecting thing to have, because they can't cope with disorder, with things not being in a straight line, with things not being in a particular way. And this is probably excessive type 2 thinking. So in the book he gives lots of examples and numerical data, objective evidence. This is really a scientific book. It's not anecdotal. There are some stories in here which help to explain some of his points. Let me just read you a short passage to give you a sample of what he's talking about. So I've just made some quotes here, and I'll just read them out. So, as you become skilled in a task, its demands for energy diminishes. Studies of the brain have shown that the pattern of activity associated with an action changes as skill increases, with fewer brain regions involved. Talent has similar effects. Highly intelligent individuals need less effort to solve the same problems, as indicated by both pupil size and brain activity. A general law of least effort applies to cognitive as well as physical exertion. The law asserts that if there are several ways of achieving the same goal, people will eventually gravitate to the least demanding course of action. In the economy, of action, effort is a cost, and the acquisition of skill is driven by the balance of benefits and costs. Laziness is built deep into our nature. Once again, it requires energy to think consciously, deliberatively, with efforts. Like the example with the bat and ball, you have to do the math, and you know that most people avoid it. Most people avoid thinking because it's, in some sense, a little bit painful. You have to actually solve the problem. So people mostly avoid it. But let me read you some other quotes, because I highly recommend this book, as it really will improve the way you think. It will make you more aware of your own errors of judgment, and over a long period of time, the benefits of this are inestimable. What you could gain from better decision making could be enormous over a 10-year period. You know, the choice of job to apply for, the job of which house to buy, the choice of partner, the choice of whether to agree to a particular cause. You know, you can waste a lot of time if you make wrong decisions. So you want to try to improve the chances of success, and this book will certainly help. Now, I'll read you one more quote, and then I will leave you to possibly research more. Daniel Kahneman has given a number of speeches on this book, and it's well worth, if you don't want to read the whole book, it would be well worth listening to him speak, because he goes into a lot of detail about some of these errors. He talks about the halo effect, and I'll just read you this. So, just trying to find. So this is a story from his own life and his own occupation as a professor. The sequence in which we observe characteristics of a person is often determined by chance. Sequence matters, however, because the halo effect increases the weight of first impressions, sometimes to the point that subsequent information is mostly wasted. Early in my career as a professor, I graded students' essay exams in the conventional way. I would pick up one test booklet at a time and read all that student's essay in immediate succession, grading them as I went. I would then compute the total and go on to the next student. I eventually noticed that my evaluations of the essays in each booklet were strikingly homogeneous. I began to suspect that my grading exhibited a halo effect, and that the first question I scored had a disproportionate effect on the overall grade. The mechanism was simple. If I had given a higher score to the first essay, I gave the student the benefit of the doubt whenever I encountered a vague or ambiguous statement later. This seemed reasonable. Surely a student who had done so well on the first essay would not make a foolish mistake in the second one. But there was a serious problem with my way of doing things. If a student had written 2 essays, one strong and one weak, I would end up with very different final grades depending on which essay I read first. I had told the students that the 2 essays had equal weight, but that was not true. The first one had a much greater impact on the final grade than the second. This was unacceptable. So once again, first impressions having a disproportionate impact on later judgments. That's the halo effect. So there's also, he goes into the framing effect, how a question is asked has quite an impact on the answers that people give, and he gives lots of interesting examples of that. So anyway, hopefully that is sufficient for you to make a decision on whether or not you would like to invest the time to read this book. I would certainly recommend it. Some people online have said it's quite difficult to read, particularly the second half, because it does become quite technical. But I am a huge fan of this book. I think it would make a significant difference. If you are an investor, for example, one thing Warren Buffett always says is you need to think rationally. And his famous quote, he said, if you have an IQ of 160, get rid of 30 IQ points, you don't need them. What you need is emotional control, because that, in his view, is more important. Not letting fear, which probably is the most, the strongest emotion, because of evolution and the need to avoid predators. It has a very powerful effect on people. So anyway, I will leave this with you. Thank you for watching.